So, good evening. I hope everybody is well, and I first of all wish to use this opportunity to welcome you all and wish you a Happy New Year. And welcome to this evening, the webinar co-organized by NEC Asia Pacific, SPDC, and HKIE on the difference in the handling claims between the traditional building contract used in Hong Kong against NEC and the beauty of using NEC in execution. So I'm Albert Lau, I'm just doing the introduction. And before I introduce the main speaker, Robert, whom I'm sure you don't need any introduction, but a few housekeeping rules for everybody. And everybody has to be pre-registered with their names for the advanced information. And to get the CPD certificate for the 1.5 hours, you should leave your full English name and email address with an asterisk as a separator in between. So for example, if you're Chen Tai Man, and then your email address, then you will be Chen Tai Man and asterisk with your email address in the Q&A block during the seminar. And the e-certificate will only be available if you have the full details provided and within 1 month following this seminar. And all the personal data provided in the Q&A will be viewed and used by staff members of the Institute who will be involved in the processing of the e-certificate. There will be a Q&A session for this seminar, and you can leave your questions in the Q&A block during the seminar. And the organizer owns the copyright for the content, and the seminar must not be recorded or republished in any way without the prior consent of the organizers. And this seminar includes a feature that allows audio, video, and any documents and materials exchanged or viewed during the session to be recorded. By joining this, you are consenting to such recordings of the materials that are shared on the platform. So this is a sort of basic rundown for tonight. So I'm now doing the introduction and followed by Robert, who will be giving you the presentation for about 40 minutes. After that, then there will be the panel discussion, which will be coordinated by myself and Mr. Vincent Gerrard for about 40 minutes until 8:30 tonight. So just a very brief introduction to Robert GERRARD, the Senior NEC Consultant and NEC Users Group Secretary. I'm sure everybody knows Robert, who is a guru in NEC and have over 35 years experience in setting up and managing contracts, and 25 years of these are using the NEC. He actually is based in Hong Kong, and he got accustomed to Hong Kong now. He just told me just now that he feels cold. Born in UK, I don't think he would be sort of, this temperature should be nothing, but he has been here for so long, he's now accustomed. He's a Hong Kongese now, so he's feeling the cold with us together. And he has been with the NEC Users Group as a secretary since 2006, and he has published a lot of information on the NEC 3 and NEC 4 compared, NEC 2 and NEC 3 compared, John Author and NEC 4, avoiding and resolving disputes, practical solutions using NEC 4 and NEC 3. And he's also an accredited mediator and a DRAD, a dispute resolution advisor. So he has immense experience, and I think he is the most appropriate person to address us on the handling of claims and the difference between using the traditional building contracts and the NEC. So without further ado, I will introduce Robert, who will give you seminar on this important and interesting topic. Robert, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah. Unaccustomed that I am to wearing jumpers in Hong Kong, so I think I've worn shorts every day I've ever been here, but right now it's cold, isn't it? So it's got a vest and a shirt and a jumper for Hong Kong. What is going on? Vincent never told me that when he recruited me this year, permanently. Never mind. At the end of last year. Okay, so what title is it? Look at this title behind me. Can you see this? Difference in handling claims between the traditional building contracts used in Hong Kong versus NEC and the beauty of the latter in execution. That's quite a title, isn't it? So my recommendation is don't write titles of that length in webinars in the future, wherever you set them up around the world. So I am, of course, a big fan of NEC contracts. I've been using them since the second edition, that was in 1995, we're now on NEC 4. I confess never to have used the GCC, but I have used similar contracts in the past. So the first 10 years of my experience was in a former contract called the ICE, Conditions Contract Institution of Civil Engineers, which frankly is extremely similar to the GCC contract, which is no surprise. So GCC quite traditional, I would say NEC is quite radical in comparison of the two. So we're going to look at this from a point of principle, not detail. It's very interesting, isn't it, that I think the most important, probably two parts of the NEC contracts are early warnings and programme, and they just about fill 2 pages of the contract between them. Yet when it comes to compensation events within NEC contracts, then that's about 6 or so pages. Why do we have so many more pages that deal with change than we do that deal with risk or risk, sort of avoidance? Question to the drafters, I suppose. Why so much emphasis on change management as opposed to risk management? So just to be clear, what versions of what contract we are looking at, I'm going to look at the Hong Kong Government General Conditions Contract for Building Works. We'll call that the GCC. That is dated 1999. I think Albert's going to ask me a question later about some recent case law now that affects GCC. Well, that recent case law is 2020, so unless they're visionaries, I dare say the GCC does not take account of that recent sort of case in the UK. Anyway, now there is, of course, GCC that covers civil engineering works as well. We just picked a form of GCC. There's not a vast amount of difference between the building works version and the civil engineering works version. So we just happened to pick the building works version. The version of NEC, although we call it NEC, we're actually going to look at this. So this one actually is on the slide, isn't it? The engineering and construction contract. NEC 4, dated June 2017 with some new amendments. Back in October 2020, there were a further 4 or 5 amendments that were made to the contract, 2 of which in response to fairly recent legislation in the UK, and some tidying up of other clauses. Now, I'm going to assume for today's purposes no amendments have been made to either contract. Wouldn't that be a nice world if such thing actually happened? For every dollar I would have in Hong Kong, I would spend 99% of that dollar writing a brilliant scope and the other cent on Z clauses. However, we seem to flick it over, and most of that dollar we spend on amendments to the contract rather than writing a brilliant scope, but never mind. So, as I say, I'm no professed expert, I hate the word expert, but never mind. I'm no expert in GCC, but I have used similar style contracts in the past. Now, I'm supposed to say the beauty of the latter in execution, but I'm hoping you would conclude that yourself. So, this word called claims, these things. So why do we have these things called claims? Let's call them claims at the moment. I've already talked about compensation events, which is the NEC speak as opposed to claims, which is the GCC speak. But let's just generalise at the moment. Let's call them all claims. So why do we have these get out of jail free cards to a contractor? Why have these things called claims? Well, strictly, you don't have to. You could put the risk of so many more things upon a contractor if you so wish to. I'm not recommending that, by the way, but you could do. And contracts really are a balance, aren't they? The drafters decide that certain things should remain the risk of the client and certain things should remain the risk of the contractor. So the decision in both GCC and NEC is to draw a line between certain things which the contractor may claim for. Okay, so as it says in the first part of that table, the aim of claims is basically to recompense a contractor for both time and money for certain events that arise during the contract. What events arise during the contract? Well, sometimes the project manager in an NEC contract will give an instruction to change the scope, or sometimes we experience really cold weather. Whether that really cold weather surpasses a 1 in 10 year return average is questionable, but we might find unexploded World War II bombs, as they found in Wanchai a year or two ago. We might encounter a pandemic, which we are in wave 4 of in Hong Kong. Things happen, don't they? During the course of a contract, things will happen. Sometimes they're foreseeable, sometimes they're not foreseeable. Certain things in both GCC and NEC give rise to basically a claim being made by the contractor to ask for some more time and or money. Sometimes they'll ask for things that is not covered, not written down specifically. We'll look later, it's up an iPad somewhere, but special circumstances is a provision, is a possible claim for an extension of time in GCC that is not in NEC. So the whole idea is to be clear to a tenderer as to what events may give rise to more time or money being given to the contractor if they should occur. Okay, and as I said, you can change the threshold. So, for example, within NEC, certain ground conditions, if you find them, the contractor may well get more recompense in additional time or money. But you could strike that clause out. I'm not recommending you do that, but you could strike it out. If you strike it out, then the contract says, whatever ground you find tough, there will be no change to the prices and or the completion date. So it's really a client decision as to how much risk they wish to hold themselves as opposed to give the contractor. And most of this debate about claims and some of the questions after will actually be about risk. What we have with GCC and NEC is 2 standard forms of contract that give risk, that allocates risk to both the contractor and the clients that the drafters think is fair in the circumstances, fair and reasonable in the circumstances. You have the right as a client to change that allocation of risk if you so wish to. You have a right as a contractor to refuse to bid where you think the risk put upon you is too great to bear. You also have the right to price for it. So please do price for risk that comes your way. Please refuse to bid where the risk is crazy. If somebody says you have 1 week to build a 15-story tower, that costs $1 billion, or else I will take damages off you in the sum of $80 million a week, you would say no thank you and politely decline to bid. So nobody's forcing anybody to bid. Nobody's forcing anybody to take inconceivable amounts of risk upon them. Every tender from actually a consultant as well as a contractor, you need to carefully consider the conditions of contract that are in front of you and look at those instances that give rise to you being able to claim in its widest sense. So the second point, a contractor cannot reasonably be expected to bear every risk in the standard form of contract, or else the offer would be dramatically different, i.e. I'm suggesting that their price would be exorbitant, a crazy increase in price. If you ask the contractor to take all risk of ground, risk of a pandemic, risk of weather, risk of third-party contractors, risk of just about everything conceivable, then their price would surely be off the scale. Now, interestingly, if if we think we have a contract but we never agreed the terms and conditions, but we basically do have a contract but we have never agreed the terms and conditions themselves, well, often, if we have a dispute, either what are the terms and conditions or within a contract without an agreed set of terms and conditions, off we will go to court, and the judge will shout at us and say how bad we are for not agreeing terms and conditions before starting the contract. But that aside, a court will often, according to my memories of basic contract law, allocate different risks to a contractor than you would find in either the GCC or the NEC. So my understanding of the starting point from a court, where we go to court without agreed terms and conditions, is that they will often they will start by allocating ground conditions and weather conditions to a contractor, because on balance, a contractor, I suppose, is more used to building things than a client is. A client is an occasional visitor to our construction industry. The contractor lives and breathes muck and bullets and things every day, and therefore a court may well allocate risks such as ground or weather to a contractor where you've not otherwise, whether you fail to agree a set of terms and conditions in the contract. Now, most contractors I know would prefer not to bid where they take the risk of all ground and all weather. But again, risk allocation is about an acceptable threshold, isn't it? If you give the risk of all ground and all weather to a contractor and they're happy with that risk allocation, providing they price accordingly, then who am I to argue otherwise? Now, the one thing I think we get dramatically wrong in our industry is the contractor doesn't price properly for the risks that they take. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. Maybe it's overcapacity. Maybe it's simple economics, supply and demand. But many contractors do not seem to price risk appropriately. We should have, in many instances, very expensive tenders coming back, considering the risks that are placed upon the contractor. So I think a good starting point for a contractor is a sound contract like GCC or NEC, where the drafters intend to allocate risks fairly to both client and contractor, which might be different to what a court might do if you turn up with a dispute without an agreed set of contract conditions. So what am I saying ultimately? A standard contract is a fair starting point for fair risk allocation, and both of these contracts give rise to what are called claims emerging under the contract. Okay, use different language, but in principle, the contractor may get more time and or money for certain events that arise under either the GCC or the NEC. So in GCC, what do we mean by claims? Well, we find that word loosely used in the title measurements, variations, valuations, and claims. So in GCC, in the building contract, we do some measurements. We have a bill of quantities, and occasionally that bill of quantities might prove to be incorrect for some reason. We have variations where we might change the requirement of works required of the contractor. We have valuations where usually every month we'll decide to give, how much the client should pay the contractor. And we have the focus really for today, this thing called claims, where something happens where the contractor believes they are due more time and or money for that event that has occurred. So I'll give claims widest meaning today, because if I don't give it a fairly wide meaning, I'm going to struggle to talk about NEC, because there is no such thing as a claim. That NEC does not use that language. Instead, the equivalent term is called a compensation event. Now, compensation events deal with measurements, variations, and claims, sort of, certainly for option B of the ECC. So the closest term we have to a claim in NEC is called a compensation event. Now, NEC lists out compensation events and says here they are in all their glory. 21 of them, I think it is, in the core clauses. Here is a series of compensation events laid down in what are called the core clauses that gives rise, if it occurs, to the contractor getting more time and more money. Similar to the basis of claims in GCC on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, sometimes in GCC, the word claim is used in a negative sense. Thank you very much. I just had something that's just appeared on the desk. That's very fine. Is it warm? Is it? I could do with a cocoa right now or something like that, or a sort of rum in this drink, but that's not going to happen, is it? Anyway, sometimes the word claim is used in the negative sense. So in GCC, it says, no claim by the contractor shall be allowed for the following circumstances. And that typical, I think clause 13.2 is about ground conditions, that I can see GCC for building works. Tough luck for the contractor, no claim for the contractor is for additional payment shall be allowed if they encounter ground which is different to that which they anticipated. You may say that's fair or unfair. It is what it is. Your chance and opportunity to argue about the allocation of risk happens at tender stage. Now, if the risk allocation is too great to the contractor, then don't bid, or bid high, put a fair amount of extra money into your bid accordingly. It's no good arguing once you're in contract, with a tear falling down your face that the allocation of risk is unfair or unreasonable. You should not bid, or you should have bid with an appropriate amount of money for it. So I would say to people, please don't cry foul once you're in contract. Okay, if you have a problem with the allocation of risk, address it at tender stage. Address it by suggesting to the client that the allocation of risk is just untenable, and if it stays as it is, you are unable to bid. And remember, you need to protect your organisation. Contractors bidding and consultants bidding need to care about next year, the year after, and 10, 20, 50 years' time. They cannot gamble their whole history of their organisation of a glorious 100 years on one job, and they guess the amount of risk money wrong, and they guess wrong, and they lose the whole organisation through one bad bid. So people need to be very careful to protect, the good name of consultants and contractors for many years to come. So don't be bullied into, bidding for things that you can't conceivably or reasonably allow for. That's what I would recommend. Now, similar. So I'm trying to do a comparison. You'll get the emphasis of this. I'm trying to compare GCC to NEC. So there isn't really a negative sense used the word claim in NEC, but you can have what we call negative compensation events. So what is a negative compensation event? Well, a negative compensation event could be something such as the project manager gives an instruction taking an amount of work out of the scope. So if we take work out of the scope, then the price should reduce because there's less work for the contractor to do. However, we never bring forward the completion date. In fact, I think that's true to say for GCC as well. We only give extensions of time. We could have some positive body language. I'll get there. I'll get one person shaking their head and one person nodding, so that's brilliant. So we don't bring forward the completion date. We only ever give an extension of time. We only ever take it out. I think that's fair to say in all contracts I've ever seen. So even if you delete a very large piece of works out of what would be the critical path of the contractor's program, we would not bring forward the completion date. Okay, you can take the money off the contractor for the saving in preliminaries that should arise, but we don't bring forward the completion date. And we basically create what is called terminal float, which ultimately belongs to the contractor. So I think that's fair to say that applies in both contracts. Now, my problem with GCC, so here's my problem in a nutshell, bottom part of this slide. Two problems that I have with standard form contracts. One is that time and money are dealt with separately. Why would you want to deal with time and money separately? So the contractor gets a number of opportunities to claim for time and money. Where there is a variation, they can ask for other than a rate or price in the document itself, in the pricing document. They may also say that they've been disruptive, that particular variation is called delay and disruption to some other parts of the works. And they are fairly due an extension of time, and they are properly due some additional preliminaries money as a result of that variation. So when a variation occurs under GCC, then as I see it, the contractor may get sort of 4 bites of the cherry. So what I mean is they could potentially get the additional direct costs of the extra works due to the variation itself. They may get loss or expense separately, they may get an extension of time separately, they may get more money for additional preliminaries separately. And these claims can actually appear in the account very close, well, there are certain timescales in the GCC, but I question if they are condition precedents. They seem to strike me as being more management dates than condition precedent dates. So it could be you get some very late notice indeed of the contractor asking for these additional amounts of time and or money, which, okay, the contractor is probably due them, but the client probably is not budgeted for the extra time and or money by this point in time. In fact, the variation occurs some time ago, some months ago, and it could well be the fact that some very many months later, the contractors now decided they are due some extra time and or money accordingly. So that's going to cause a problem in itself. So I think we're better than that as an industry. I think we're much better than that. So I think the client is deserving, as close to real time as we possibly can do, of knowing the implications of change. So where they get their advisor, their project manager in the NEC, to give a change to the scope itself, surely as close to real time as we can get, we should be, the client should be knowledgeable of the extra time and or money associated with that change. That to me is professional, that is ethical, that is reasonable in the circumstances. That is us doing a professional job. I say us, so I mean us, the collective us. That's everybody in the industry. I think everybody in the industry owes it to their own organisations and our clients to deal with change claims, if you want to use that word, in real time. I just don't think it's an acceptable process to not deal with change until potentially after substantial completion has occurred. And certainly my experience with an equivalent contract to GCC, which is the ICE conditions of contract, is that we did not deal with claims until sometime after substantial completion occurred, which is a horror show. That's an absolute horror show. Now, my first job, I think it was probably 2.5 years after substantial completion occurred, we got a final account. My second job, 4 years after substantial completion occurred, we got a final account. That's a horror show. That's an absolute horror show. That means up to 4 years, cutting across different financial years for the different organisations, we have a huge amount of uncertainty of how much the client will ultimately pay the contractor for this job. So we are better than that. We are definitely better than that. We are, by and large, pretty bright people, pretty clever, who need to deal with change contemporaneously with the change emerging. So what compensation events try and do through the NEC process is deal with time and money together for each event, for each compensation event, in a fairly timely fashion, i.e. fairly close to when the compensation event actually occurred. I would love NEC to progress that. I would love a client to progress that. And I would love clients to think about setting up change management teams that basically deal with compensation events almost days after they are notified, and we reach the conclusion of them a few days after a compensation event is notified. Why not? What is stopping us doing that? There's simply nothing stopping us dealing with claims, dealing with change management, compensation events, whatever you want to call it, almost contemporaneously with the events occurring. Okay, so I suppose that's my biggest beef with GCC is the uncertainty of when the contractor, when and how much time and or money the contractor may actually ask for in their claim. And strictly, in fairness, under the GCC contract, a lot of these matters we'll see later are left with a named quantity surveyor to deal with certainly the money, and the architect to deal with time, and they seem to do that separately, not together, which I find a little bit strange. But the contractor may, of course, raise a dispute at any time, say I'm not happy with the outcomes of your decisions, and take the dispute to the lights of arbitration. So a huge amount of uncertainty in the process, I think, the GCC, of navigating a correct passage through a claim. So, still on the subject, what is a claim? So in GCC, the things the contractor may or may not claim are stated in the contract. They may claim for certain things. Can I do this in time? Will this work? Welcome to the world of iPads, webinars, and the likes. There we go. So what may you claim? So let me just look at things like extension of time. And I'll come back to it if I need this a little bit later. But if in the opinion of the architect, the cause of the delay, so there's been some sort of a delay, is inclement weather. What is inclement weather? I know what weather is. Weather's out there now, it's cold. What is inclement? I don't know. Very cold? I don't really know. I have no idea what is inclement weather. And actually we can go around the room here or out there and say, do you think this weather right now in Hong Kong is inclement? I have no idea. Half of you might say yes, half of you might say no. There is an uncertainty as to what is inclement weather. But what was my point here? My point is the contract is trying to give clear thresholds of what may be claimed for, what recompense may be given. This is quite clear. There's a cause of a delay, which is the hoisting of tropical cyclone warning signal 8 or above. That's pretty clear. Or a black rainstorm warning. That's pretty clear. Or an instruction issued by the architect. That's pretty clear. Give me an instruction, and if in the opinion that causes a delay, you may get an extension of time. And other such things. But the architect shall, within a reasonable time come to who or what, considers whether the contractor is fairly entitled, fairly according to what and who, an extension of time for the completion of the works or any extension thereof. Lots of uncertainty for the contractor's position, knowing exactly when they will or will not get, an extension of time. So the drafters, in fairness, have tried to lay out a series of events that give rise to possibly a claim occurring. However, it is very much in the hands of the architect to determine whether or not that event has caused a delay and whether or not the contractor is fairly due an extension of time accordingly. A tremendous amount of uncertainty. On the other hand, I thought this might work half well, but there you go. Not that I need this, I seem to not be able to sleep for remembering all these clauses, but never mind. All compensation events, or most of the compensation events, let me rephrase that, are stated in clause 60.1 of the ECC, and they're just listed. So, if the project manager gives an instruction changing the scope, it is a compensation event. If a test or inspection done by the supervisor causes unnecessary delay, it is a compensation event. If an event which is a client's liability stated in these conditions of contract occurs, it is a compensation event. If the project manager certifies takeover of a part of the works before both completion and the completion date, it is a compensation event. So many of these are actually fairly objective. If the event occurs, it is a compensation event. However, it doesn't automatically mean the contractor gets more time and more money. I think on balance, it should be easy to identify what is a compensation event rather than what is an event that may give rise to a claim under a GCC contract. Now, in GCC, those events that I just walked through fairly quickly are stated. They are not in themselves optional, and that I can see you cannot add to it other than through special conditions of contracts. However, with NEC, you may increase, well, in fact, you may decrease the amount of compensation events. The very last compensation event, clause 60.121, I think that's right, says other compensation events stated in the contract data. You can actually, under an ECC contract, list out whether 5, 10 or 15 Z clauses if you wish to. MTR is shut for more than 2 hours. The airport is shut for more than 3 hours. The price of oil set by whoever exceeds $100 US per barrel. Actually, didn't go down to minus $35 a barrel recently. Hopefully, some of you have got tankers near refineries and are filling up your tankers and getting paid $35 US per barrel for filling your tanker. Probably unlikely. So we have 21 clauses, 21 compensation events in clause 60.1. 3 more if you use options B or D. You can increase that in the contract data if you want to. You could decrease it through the Z clause if you want to. Some of the secondary options, such as 2, a change in the law if incorporated. Also bring in a list of compensation events. So in fact, your list of compensation events is actually variable, depending on the main secondary options that you choose and whether or not you insert any more compensation events into the contract data. So be careful as a bidder to understand and identify exactly what is the compensation event, whereas it's already predetermined in the GCC, except in the special conditions, you might find some changes. So as I say, at the end, the employer in the GCC may increase or decrease that list of claims, or may change any of the descriptions. You might put, instead of adverse weather, or what's it saying? No, bear with me. Inclement weather. I'm sure I've seen a stamp on the contract that said exceptionally inclement weather. So what is inclement weather? I don't know, lots of rain. What's exceptionally inclement weather? Lots and lots of rain. I've no idea. You see the point, you see the problem. So what is examples of a claim? So by claim, I am meaning compensation events as well as the claim in the traditional sense in the GCC. So examples of claims the contractor may ultimately make. A variation might be valued or seen linked by the quantity surveyor, but disputed by the contractor. Therefore, in essence, it's a claim. We may have a variation. We may have a day work, not a term used in NEC. We may have what's called disturbance to the progress of the works due to a variation. So because of a variation, that causes disturbance to the regular progress of the rest of the works. Now, all of those, well, essentially those three things are all encapsulated where the project manager changes the scope in an NEC contract. Where the project manager changes the scope, then that may cause direct effects on cost or indirect effects on cost. It may cause effects on time. That changing of the scope could cause direct or indirect effects. Back to GCC, we may have disturbance due to late instructions or late decisions, where those decisions, if you respond outside of the due time, which in itself is not clear to me, then a claim may well arise. In NEC, it's a little bit more clear where the project manager does not respond within the period for reply stated. Every time a project manager needs to reply to a communication, they are on the clock. And if they fail to do what they should do within the time stated, then a further compensation occurs, which actually doesn't really help the contractor. But it does make the project manager mindful that all replies to all communications must be done not in a timely manner, but according to the time the contract gives the project manager. Further examples of claim in GCC: disturbance due to late delivery of something by the employer. Similar events in NEC. The client misses a date on the accepted program for the supply of something, which the scope says the client will give you free issue. That I can see, there are no ground conditions claim in the building works version of GCC. Certain physical conditions, if encountered, can cause compensation events to occur in NEC. Okay, so similar but different, aren't they? Not radically different then. So I wouldn't expect anything radically different. You can see things match, sort of, between GCC and NEC. No radical differences of what may be claimed for. However, then it gets a little bit more interesting. So in GCC, we have somebody called the surveyor. It may not be called once, I can't remember, quantity surveyor, but anyway. They value variations in clause 61 in their opinion. Note the word his as well. We don't use male gender now in NEC, it's all neutralised, which is good stuff, of course. So in the surveyor's opinion, if the variation should be valued using the rates in the contract, then that's the way it is. In fact, there's a very interesting case, I can't remember, Henry Boots and Alston, I think, that is the case in the UK, where the judge basically says a rate is a rate is a rate. If you get your rates wrong, tough luck, because if there's a variation to the works and the new works are very similar, but in fact, no, let me get this right. The new works are the same as that in the existing contract, a rate is a rate is a rate. You are stuck to those rates. Interestingly, those rates in that particular case were high, but a rate is a rate is a rate if the rate is low. So low or high, you're stuck with the rates that you put forward, and they may extend into valuing varied works. They should also be used, they shall be used for varying works that are not of the same character, that are similar, but you shall use that same bad rate as a starting point. That's another problem that I have with standard form contracts. A rate is a rate is a rate. You are promising as a contractor that you will stand by your rates, not only for the original works, but also for varied works, which is a heck of a promise, isn't it? I'm sure I would make that as a contractor. Now what we're trying to do is a complete contrast. This is an absolute contrast within NEC, is that every conversation event, we do not revert to using the rates and prices in the original document. We go back to first principles. And we establish basically a market rate, a fair rate for each conversation event. So we discard potentially the badly priced rate or price in the original document, which personally I think is entirely equitable. Others may disagree, but you can see a big difference here between GCC and NEC. GCC very much looks to rely upon the rates themselves that are in the document. NEC abandons them when it comes to conversation events and tries to put the contractor in the position they would have been in but for the conversation event. However, I'm drifting slightly because this is about who assesses the claim. So the surveyor looks at the money side. The surveyor ascertains the cost incurred for service events. I wonder how the surveyor actually does that, where the person who actually knows what the costs incurred are is the contractor. How can the surveyor ever determine what the costs incurred by the contractor are? The contractor knows what the additional costs are. How would the surveyor ascertain them? Now, of course, the contractor will furnish the surveyor, but surely the claim itself should come from the contractor, not determined by the surveyor. Anyway. A contractor may also claim a higher rate than that notified by the surveyor. So the surveyor may say, yeah, it's some additional works, it's variation, and I choose that particular rate in there, which is very, very, very low. And the contractor may claim a higher rate. But the contractor is on the clock here because the surveyor will not consider a claim if 180 days after the date of completion. Otherwise, well, that's as stated in the Settlements of Disputes clause 88. Now, how effective that is, again, is questionable. So this is looking to be a condition precedent type clause. Now, you've got to be very, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to pretend to be a lawyer. You have to be very careful indeed with condition precedent clauses. Tell somebody about the timescale and tell them very clearly what the implications are if you fail to meet that timescale. I don't know if these clauses pass that condition precedent test or they are just management dates. It would be interesting to hear a lawyer's view of GCC timescales like 180 days. Is that a management date? Is that just please do this by this date, or thou shalt, or else lose any entitlement? I mean, NEC, the contractor, is always given a chance to provide a quotation. So the first person who actually asks for an amount of time or money is the contractor, which I think is right and proper, because they are the people who are on the receiving end of the effects of a claim. It should, in my opinion, for them to say, in the first instance, this is how much time and/or cost I think that I've reasonably and wrongly incurred as a result of the conversation event. However, the person who ultimately decides whether they agree with that or not is the project manager. And the project manager, as shown in the second line there, is able to determine the conversation event, that the amount of time and money associated with it, if there is disagreement. If the contractor asks for 100, the project manager thinks it's 10, project manager can ask the contractor to give a revised quotation. If the revised quotation comes back as 100 and not anywhere nearer to the 10 the project manager thinks it is, the project manager is perfectly free to say, right, I will assess that conversation event myself and I assess it as 10. They need to be very careful. The next person who may look after that assessment could well be an adjudicator or arbitrator. And if that person finds that the project manager has not acted in accordance with the contract, there could be problems afoot. Now, the contractor's get out of jail free card if they think they're on the receiving end of a wrong assessment of a compensation event is to pursue a dispute in one of the dispute resolution clauses. I'll put this as option W. This is in fact in the ECUC, option W1, W2 and W3. Probably in Hong Kong, the most likely option will be W1 followed by W2. At the moment, because there is no security of payment legislation, W2 should not be used in Hong Kong, so either W1 or W2. So if as a contractor you are on the receiving end of an assessed compensation event that you think is far too low, probably unlikely to challenge one that is far too high, but far too low, you may dispute it formally through option W1. So when do we assess the claim? Well, in the GCC, the contractor is obliged to give notice as soon as practicable, but in any event, within 28 days after the cause has arisen. It doesn't strictly say that, hence the dots, but I've paraphrased. But again, is that a condition precedent? If they give notice within 29 days, is the claim dead? I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure I'm reading that as a condition precedent type clause. Be interested in other people's views. Architect determines within a reasonable time, as I mentioned earlier. What is a reasonable time? A reasonable time, but what if they're very busy? What if the architect is very busy for a year and can't look at it for a year? In fact, I was told it was a contract in the UK, building contracts, where 1 year after the job finished, the architect sent a letter and said, I have reviewed the extension of time provisions and I've found another week for you. Ah, fantastic. Except that the job was finished a year ago, so truly, what benefit is the extra week 1 year after it was needed? In fact, it's more than a year, has passed since the contractor really needed. Now, all it will do is potentially give rise to an extra week's worth of preliminaries being recovered, and if liquidated damages were taken off the contractor, maybe the repayment of that. But really, the contractor needed that week during the contract when the issue arose, not 1 year after substantial or practical completion, which is the JCT equivalent. So we really need to, I think, as an industry, step up and give these changes to the completion date at the time when it's most needed. It is not needed 1 year after the job's finished. Now, interestingly, with NEC, in my opinion, the project manager is actually responsible for notifying most compensation events to the contractor, which is completely the opposite to most of the forms of contract. Most of the forms of contract, it falls to the contractor to ask for more time or money, not the client's representative telling the contractor they are due more time and money. So I would suggest 90% of all compensation events arise in NEC contracts because of the project manager changing the scope, and therefore, if you believe that statistics, 90% of all compensation events should be notified by project manager to contractor. Now, there is an effective time bar in clause 61.3. For the other 10% of the compensation events, they fall to be notified by contractor to the project manager. Now, there is, I know of no lawyer that says this is not an effective time bar. In clause 61.3, it says if you notify a compensation event more than 8 weeks after becoming aware of it, it's time barred. So that is a very effective time bar. The time bar only applies to those compensation events exclusively that should be notified by the contractor to project manager, not the other way around. Now, with the GCC, that I can't find for the money side of a claim a timetable upon disturbance. It seems to be upon written application of the contractor. What if this is the day before the final account is due to be submitted? Is that sufficient? I don't think that's professionally acceptable. I think that's fairly immoral, but I think that's perfectly legitimate in the contract. So how on earth do we account for that? How do we manage that? What is the timetable for valuing variations? I could not find the timetable for valuing variations. There is a complete uncertainty in when these claims are assessed in GCC. There is good practice. Good practice is surely within a reasonable time after the right to TAML money occurs, but but the contract doesn't say that. It doesn't use that terminology. However, with NEC, it is that little bit more robust. Once it is established a compensation event has occurred that is not the fault of the contractor has just 3 weeks to provide a quotation. If they do not provide a quotation, they lose the rights to provide a quotation, and the project manager will do their own version of what they think is the quotation for the compensation event. If they do provide a quotation, the project manager responds within 2 weeks of receiving it. Note all these are maximum periods, not minimum periods. So definitely a more robust process for dealing with compensation events in what I would call a timely fashion as opposed to GCC. So how do we assess the claim? As I mentioned, within GCC, the architect considers whether the contractor is fairly entitled to an extension of time. And those events include things like inclement weather, which means what? Variations and disturbance. Fairly entitled. What does that mean? I have no idea. Would two architects always agree when a contractor should be fairly entitled to something? I don't think they would. I don't think there's a common understanding of what is a fair entitlement to inclement weather. And we could do that test. We could run that, series of scenarios and say, do you think the contractor is fairly entitled to this piece of inclement weather? And I bet you we would never get 100% consistency. So it's very uncertain. So in terms of money, generally, as I mentioned, the money side of a claim, certainly for variations and the like, is based upon rates that are set. So be very careful as a contractor in putting reasonable rates in the first place. Don't be silly, don't gamble, don't load or unload rates. Just price them properly and fairly. They could turn around to have a significant effect upon you. As I mentioned, we deal with all these things separately at separate times. So as I said, I think we're better than that professionally. So NEC, on the other hand, deals with time and money together. There's a bottom-up approach for assessing time. What's called defined cost? What is the effect the compensation rate has upon defined cost? Defined cost being very, very close to the real actual cost the contractors likely to encounter. For money, we are looking at something called an accepted program, and we're looking to determine what delay we forecast the compensation rate will have upon planned completion as shown on the most appropriate accepted program. One quotation deals with both time and money. So we are basically dealing with compensation rates with NEC contracts, one at a time, ideally in the sequence in which they occur, fairly close to wrapping the whole thing up within, should be no more than a few weeks after the compensation rate first arose and or was notified. So summary, crept past my 10 to 8, but there you go, I'm sure that's acceptable. GCC, very traditional style of contracts. The parties are bound to those tendered rates for assessing variations. Highly risky for both parties. How many people do significant sensitivity analysis of the rates in GCC contracts? All of this seems to be done in hindsight. Hindsight is not a good way for contract management. We are better than that. We should be doing proactive contracts or project management, not hindsight management. You are most likely to have a significant lapse in time between the event arising and receiving recompense, receiving monies for the effect that event has on the time and cost of the contractor. That I can see there is zero collaboration whatsoever within GCC contract when it comes to assessing time and money. Quite distinct partitioning of a contractor, architect and surveyor. I cannot even find where the architect talks to the surveyor, let alone talks to the contractor. So of what certainly Development Bureau are wishing to achieve here, where we're trying to drive an industry based upon collaboration. We're collaborating here today with all these different bodies. We're trying to bring, trying to professionalise the industry and bring these fragmented parts together. I find on balance there is complete uncertainty in the entire process. Were I a contractor, I'd be very nervous to make the price for GCC. think very carefully about the risk that is placed upon you, about how these rates and prices might be used in anger against you in time. NEC is therefore not traditional, it's quite radical. It is trying to compensate the contractor fairly for the time and cost effects that the event has upon them. Now, we are doing that on generally a forecast basis, foresight, not hindsight. And it is mostly intended to be done with foresight. A real challenge to us is a cultural challenge. How many of us are comfortable using foresight rather than hindsight? We seem to have all been brought up, trained and used contracts that steeped in hindsight. Now this contract comes along and asks us to use foresight, very different proposition. The intention is that fairly close to real time, we process each conversation event we get from start to finish in good time. It is wholly collaborative. We don't expect a them and us approach. I want the project manager to sit down, roll the sleeves up, work jointly with the contractor, do joint quotations, don't do a them and us approach. It is a pretty robust process, but there is no certainty of outcome. I cannot guarantee you that the NEC approach is cheaper or quicker than the GCC. In fairness, we start by saying they're similar in the events that give rise to claims. They really should be fairly similar in the outcome of each of these processes. We just have a different way of achieving a common goal. I think there's a lot of finger crossing done by the contractor in GCC. They hope they get a reasonable surveyor, they hope they get a reasonable architect, they hope things go fairly well. In fact, they probably hope there are no claims, because if there are claims, they will do this, they will cross their fingers. And it's not clear to me, in some instances, how the surveyor and architects go about deciding things. Lots of risks seem to sit with the contractor, their prices, and therefore, if I were the contractor pricing the GCC, I personally would price this significantly higher than I would do an NEC contract. Significantly higher, particularly the target cost contract. Far more risk seems to me to sit with the contractor in GCC than it does with NEC. Therefore, the price should be higher. Just how does, ultimately, so the professional job of the architect and surveyor is to keep the employer informed of the likely completion date, the likely final price payable to the contractor. Just how do you do that? How do you do that when you've no idea a contractor is preparing a claim that it might arrive on your desk at some point in the future? Just how do you keep the client, the employee, informed of such things? Within NEC, the contractor has a chance to demonstrate the effects. We look at these things one at a time. They're not huge claims, they're conversation events at a time. We may, of course, have mini fallouts, but there should be a mini fallout. I think on balance, I'd much rather have lots of little conversation events than one large claim from the contractor. That's my opinion. I think on balance there's a more equitable balance of risk between the parties, and that should result in lower prices and shorter time periods on the programme. And as I say, the one at a time compensation rate should give a better handle on the final amount payable. The project manager, which could be a combination of architect and or surveyor, is of course obliged to keep the clients up to date at all times the final price payable. What the tender total is that point in time. That's far more important. What is the final price likely to be paid from the client to the contractor? That should be uppermost in our minds at all times, whichever contract we're using. So on summary here, which contract do you think on balance is likely to lead to agreements and not disputes? You can decide that. You guys decide that. It's not straightforward. Why do we have 6 pages of conversation clauses? Because change management is not easy. It's, I think, the most difficult part of the entire contract. Change management is very difficult indeed. The most difficult part of the contract. But you can decide the first question. These are questions back to you guys, and you might have questions back to me as a result. Which of these 2 contracts on balance, GCC or NEC, gives us a better understanding of the difference and sometimes conflicting needs and interests, and therefore a chance to focus on alignment? How do we know what a contractor has suffered where they're asking for a sort of a disruption type claim in GCC, but we do know within a fairly short time with NEC, and you get to see it, you can challenge it, of course you can challenge it. These things will emerge in GCC, these things are in your face in NEC. Ultimately, where, you know, thinking from the taxpayer perspective of Hong Kong, which of these two contracts is likely to lead to a better outcome? The Development Bureau has chosen to use NEC for a reason. That one main reason is to, you know, to create collaboration. But generally, I think it also has the taxpayer in mind. It wishes the taxpayer to pay less money for our construction contracts than they would otherwise do with GCC. Otherwise, frankly, if I'm honest, there is simply no point using NEC. If it doesn't lead to the taxpayer paying less, and it doesn't lead to greater collaboration, which is a much more enjoyable and rewarding approach, then what is the point of using NEC? In fact, if it costs the same or more, then we should revert back to GCC immediately. You know, don't take that as a threat, by the way. You know? And we need to prove this, don't we? We need to prove that NEC actually works, that results in, you know, safer, more efficient, more productive works that cost less and/or take less time, where individuals, all of us, work less hours, ideally, have less stress, have more hair as a result of it, and are not, you know, are not bullied, are not stressed out. There's a human consequence to claims. That's something I'd like to think about. There is a human consequence to claims, and my experience of claims is not a good consequence to a human to deal with claims. Lots of stress, lots of sleepless nights, less hair that results. There's a better way of doing it. That better way is conversation events, but you need to do them collaboratively. You need to do them together and collaboratively. I've definitely outstayed my welcome of doing the presentation, and we still have 30 minutes for questions. So, panel discussion, here we go. Albert, I think. Albert and a chair, or two chairs. And we're about to be flanked. I'm also about to drink some of this. No idea what it is, so wish me luck.
So thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting discussion on handling of claims, and I'm sure the audience will learn a lot. And for the next 30 minutes or so until 8:30, then we have this questionnaire session, and myself and also Vincent Chung, who is head of NEC Asia Pacific, will try to be the moderator. And if you have questions, just type into the Q&A, and just also a reminder, if you haven't submitted all your details for the CPD certificates, type in all your details to the Q&A block. Otherwise, we can't issue the certificate to you. So,
can we get the questions bigger? Is there any chance of getting those? As I get older, not only does my hair fall out, but my eyes stop working as well. My knees hurt. So it's really haven't got a lot going for me. Okay. If I were an animal, these two would have me put down probably now. So, no.
We read it for you. No, we'll read for you. Okay, open your eyes. So, perhaps I'll just also be interested to know that, Robert, that there are lots of sort of nowadays on this modular integrated construction, MIC, both in Hong Kong as well as even the UK, etc. So everybody is talking about that with the obvious advantages in safety, quality, and minimization of time and money, etc. But it really is, to me, I believe, a change in the way the contractors will be working, particularly because you now have this MIC supplier who is actually doing a lot of the works in terms of value and taking a lot of risk, etc.
Yeah.
So how do you think, in terms of MIC construction, in terms of claims, would that be arising out of this, dealing with it under GCC or the NEC, and how would you think we need to sort of cater for this MIC?
Is that claims from the MIC contractor or claims from the contractor?
Maybe from both, right?
From both, yeah.
Yes, because
so things could emerge from
exactly,
both.
Exactly, yes.
I mean, the biggest problem we will have, I think, is agreeing the scope of works that the MIC guy will do before they press the go button and prefabricate.
Yes.
Once they press the go button and their factory is producing these fabulous products, then we have a real problem, don't we? So if you say, oh, I wanted something different, then that's going to cost you, somebody, the client, presumably a lot of money to change something which is prepared in factory conditions. So we need to work closely and carefully and reasonably quickly with the MIC person to make sure that we are completely comfortable with the products that they're about to produce. I would imagine BIM will help us tremendously there. So we're able to look and see what we're likely to get. So we stand in our room and look around. Yes, I don't like that, or I do like that, or you know. But I think it will be extremely expensive in time and money to change these products once they arrive on site. That's obvious, I suppose, isn't it? So don't do it.
Okay.
So don't do that one. I don't suppose there'll be much difference between NEC and GCC if the client changes the scope of the MIC's work, it's going to have a similar sort of thing. And the contractor won't be taking that risk. Unless those works are managed by the contractor who engages the MIC just as a pure subcontractor. We give a scope. I suppose it's the same effect. If the contractor changes the MIC, then we won't see those claims. They're not materialised. Now, if the MIC person themselves delays, that's the point I was going to. In a not a nominated subcontractor situation, a domestic subcontractor, if the MIC supplier is late, that's the contractor's problem. So that's how both contractors will deal with it. So I suppose we're dealing with, you know, all the different things that could go wrong. They're fairly similar basis for dealing with them. So I don't think there's going to be what is the ultimate question. Possible claims. If we choose to gamble and change the scope of that, that's very dangerous once the button's been pressed and these things are being produced. So what do you think of that as an answer? Okay, good.
Okay, and also you talk about the compensation of claims, etc. Now, everybody this year is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully 2021 with the vaccination will be sort of going away quickly. But people are talking, and even in Hong Kong now we have a few construction sites who has been sort of closed down in the Central Kowloon Expressway, etc., all affected. So what is the claim that you will be envisaged? For example, people are talking about force majeure, but then in the common law system, there's no force majeure, right? No force majeure in GCC. Right. So how do you think this with the COVID-19 in terms of this claims? How do you think?
Well, I was looking at this earlier. So in GCC, certainly there's an extension of time. If in the opinion of the architect, the cause of the delays, this is clause 50. The cause of the delay is any special circumstance of any kind whatsoever. Then the architect shall, within a reasonable time, blah blah blah, consider if the contractor is fairly entitled to an extension of time. Any special circumstance of any kind whatsoever. So to me, the closest fit under GCC is that special circumstance. But is it such a special circumstance in Hong Kong in wave 4 of a pandemic? A pandemic is a pandemic, and a pandemic, in my little head, means that it goes around the world like that, which is why we're in wave 4. It's a pandemic. So, when it first came, well, of course, wave 1, and when WHO said it's a pandemic and we all panicked, etc., then that clause, I would suggest, if it did have a, have a delaying effect, you would say, well, that's a special circumstance. But wave 2, 3, 4, and you're very optimistic, I'm less optimistic. I'm going to go to wave 5, 6 and 7.
Oh dear.
Well, of a diminishing effect, as different Australia, things like that, you know. And some people will refuse the vaccine, so you're not going to vaccinate everybody. We'll just keep going until the entire world is vaccinated. I fail to see how you can vaccinate the entire world.
Yes.
Unless you hold them down and vaccinate them, which is going to take some effort, then this thing's going to carry on. So I can foresee in the future, for next year, this thing carrying on and on. So is that a special circumstance of any kind? I'm not so sure it is. However, you're right to be optimistic and say because of the vaccine, then surely things should have a dramatic positive effect. And I would subscribe to that. They'll have a dramatic positive effect. When we turn to NEC, then there is a clause called prevention. But prevention, to me, probably only works with the first time round pandemic again. Again, second, third, and fourth are fairly foreseeable, and contractors have been bidding during the pandemic. So if you bid during the pandemic and the pandemic is still there, you should know about it. So, however, I'm not trying to pass the risk to the contractor here, but what I am saying is that we need to act like adults and have a reasonable allocation of risk between the parties. So anybody setting up a contract now, in my opinion, should properly and carefully think about how is it fair and reasonable to deal with the ongoing effects of the pandemic. So I think these two clauses applied in wave 1. These two clauses in these two contracts were there for wave 1. I'm not so sure they still apply for wave 2, 3, and 4. But I think that people should think about the ongoing consequences of the pandemic and deal with that properly. Here's a special condition of contract, and in the NEC as an additional conversation event. And you might put a threshold in. You might say something like the effects of any future wave, a future wave of COVID-19, because you've got to call it COVID-19 because there could be other pandemics, but anyway, without trying to worry people too much, and I'm not a scientist, but the COVID-19 pandemic, you would say if a future wave causes more than 1 week shutdown to operations on site or something like that, you would just put a reasonable threshold.
Yeah, good advice, good comment. Then I noticed that NEC recently, 2020, they have some amendments, right? Yeah. And then one of them is talking about, I suppose it's because of the triple point case, that's about the termination of a contract and how do you calculate the damages. And then they have now, after the termination, and completed work will be only general damage, you can't use the liquidated damage, etc., etc.
Yeah.
What is your view? And I suppose things may still be changing, particularly if they go to the Supreme Court, right?
You would presume so. So let's look at that particular. This to me is a risk. It's a risk, isn't it? So yes. I've never thought about this before. If I'm quite honest, I've never encountered a project of this nature. I've never heard of anything like this. Something that was sprung upon me, and I never contemplated the fact that if there is, let's say, termination because of contractor default, then they are potentially still on the hook for delay damages until completion of the project occurs. So they have to wait for some other contractor to come along and be appointed to finish off the works that they were terminated from because of their wrongful acts. And then potentially they could face delay damages. And if you ask me, does the contract provide for that? I would have said no. I would have automatically said no, it doesn't provide for that. Upon termination, your right to damages should cease, and that is actually what is in the contract now. So in the amendments, it says something like the amended wording is upon the issue of the termination certificate by the project manager, the right to. We call it here delay damages in the NEC, in here it's liquidated damages, one of the same thing, then it ceases at that point. However, through the termination clauses, if it was termination because of, let's say, breach by the contractor, so wrongful, something wrong that the contractor did, you may be able to recover the additional monies it will cost you to get the contractor to come in and finish off, but not also to cover the delay damages. However, if you wish to recover delay damages as well as other costs, then suppose you can do it.
Yeah.
But you would need to write it into your contract. So if we go back to the risk argument, I started talking about risk earlier. What is the risk? What is the likelihood of a contractor, effectively, the contract being terminated because of wrongfulness by the contractor and damages being taken from the contractor? What is the likelihood of that? I personally, I've never been involved in a contract where we've thrown the contractor out. I've been involved in a contract where there's been termination, like a recent one with a client for Carillion in the UK, where the contractor went insolvent. So then you have termination, but that's not wrongful, by the contractor. So to me, it's there's a lot of pressure, a lot of attention on this by experts in this field and journalists. But what is the likelihood of this happening?
Okay.
I'd rather we spend our money writing better scopes than worrying about this.
Spend the 99 cents.
Let's spend 99 more cents writing a brilliant scope. Let's involve NIC and let's sort that stuff out. Let's not worry about these things. However, if you took that and took my advice and ignored this, then you'd probably sue me for negative advice, because we can't cater for everything, can we? I mean, ultimately, do we sit here and discuss little green men from Mars? How do we know they're green? We've no idea. How do we know they're men? We've no idea. But and as for GCC, well, that's 1999. That case was 2020. That I can see. I couldn't really find an answer to the question here. It appeared to me that the liquidated damages stopped upon termination, is what it appeared to me.
Yes.
But don't take that as, I can't give legal advice, but definitive advice. I was struggling to find my way around the contract to see what happened there. But to me, this is a risk item that you put on your project risk register, that you say, damages and losses in connection with termination caused by wrongful doing of the contractor. And if you think that merits $100,000 worth of expert advice, go spend $100,000. Or give it to charity, actually. I would give the money to charity.
Okay. Rob, we use the word claims and compensations events being used interchangeably today. Could you highlight the key difference between the two from the perspective of proactive contract management? We know it's different. If there's any mechanism in GCC or NEC that could prevent claims or compensation events from arising, there's no perfect word.
So for a proactive contract management, I personally, sorry GCC, but I do not think it's proactive contract management. It's hindsight, hindsight contract management, wait and see. And I think the contractor does this. They sit and cross their fingers and hope they get fair recompense in time and money, which I think we're better than that. I think as an industry, we've moved on, we're better than that. So the NEC is far more proactive. However, you still may do that as a contractor, because you still might not get a great ECC project manager, or you may not recover the money all the time that you think you are due. It's not a foregone conclusion. So I'm not trying to suggest that you get more time or money through NEC. In fairness to both contracts, we're trying to give the contractor the right time or money, the right time or money that they're properly due under the terms of the contract. That's all we're trying to give the contractor. NEC is far more proactive. I don't think GCC is proactive. I would love to say that the end product of both contracts is that the contractor will get the same amount of time or money. It's probably not the case. We'll never prove that, will we? But in fairness, the drafters of both are trying to give something fair and equitable in the circumstances. What I started by doing is giving a list of events and saying, oh look, they match fairly closely to each other, other than ground conditions in the building one, where tough luck contractor, good luck guessing what the ground is, but other than that, they match quite well. Now, your second point about the prevent claims, how you prevent claims? Wow. Well, write a brilliant scope in the first place. Don't change it once you're in contracts.
Good suggestion.
Do the things as project manager, client, or supervisor that you promise you would do, and that will prevent all the compensation events occurring. Do an extensive site investigation. I think you have a moral duty, if nothing else, as a client, to know what is in your ground, your site. Know what's there. You know, well, we don't want to find voids and a contractor's guy falling into the void and getting injured or worse. We don't want that. We don't want to find asbestos that we should have found in an asbestos survey. We don't want to find things.
Surprises.
We don't want surprises. We don't want surprises. So do more advanced works. Do some extensive site investigations. Most contractors I know are not good at predicting the future. They're not crystal ball gazers. They're not good at telling us the lottery numbers. Otherwise, we'd all be rich. But the other prevention thing is that you do have condition precedents, time bar clauses in NEC that I don't believe are present in GCC. So this is something that happened with NEC 3. We took legal advice to say that all the dates that we had in the contract, which were written similar to GCC, are just please will you do it by dates rather than have teeth. There was no teeth. So I'm not convinced there is teeth in the GCC, but there is teeth in NEC. So whilst I'm lauding NEC saying how good it is, there's some teeth in there. So contractors need to, in good time, notify those compensation rates that they must do, or else, sorry, but they're not a conversation event.
Early warning.
Please give early warnings. Yeah. Next question.
Okay, thank you. So modular construction is a hot topic in Hong Kong today, as Albert said. What would be your view on the use of nominated subcontractor or named subcontractors for procuring the MIC works? Is there any advantage of using the engineering and construction subcontract, which is the same, within the same NEC series for procurement purpose?
I think you definitely should procure certainly the MIC guys on NEC contracts. I would definitely do that. Otherwise, the contractor will place what I call piggy in the middle. So they'll have NEC term here and some other T's and C's down here. There's a mismatch. So we're going to help the contractor fulfil their obligations in their head contract. So I would definitely use NEC forms of subcontract for the MIC person. Now, as for nominated, we don't do nominated subcontractors within NEC contracts, and there's a whole history of how bad nominated subcontracting can actually be. And even in GCC, it seems to me that the risk of failure of performance of the nominated subcontractor sits with the employer. So don't use nominated subcontractors. And if you have lots of nominated subcontractors, why are you bothering to use a contractor? You might as well be the contractor yourself and manage your own nominated subcontractors. Not a fan of nominated subcontracting. I did read an article by a lawyer not too long ago who suggested that if you put one company in the scope, say you shall go to this company, then that would likely be deemed nomination in disguise, even if you've not called it a nominated subcontractor, because the contractor has no choice. They must go to that firm, and if that firm goes out of business, it then becomes impossible to actually provide that part of the works, which must be a client risk, because you've now got an impossible contract. I cannot get that organisation to do that part of the works because there is no organisation in the world who exists. So, huge risk, I think, with nominated subcontractors. I think what we'll see is contractors aligning with MIC subcontractor suppliers. I think you'll see a good integrated. What I want to see is contractors bringing integrated supply chains to the table and say to clients, look, we've worked with this designer, with this supplier, with this subcontractor before. We've built some magnificent hospitals, we've built some magnificent schools. We know each other inside out and each other's businesses. We work very well together. But what is a real risk to to everybody is creating brand new relationships on the contract just awarded, and then trying in record time to cement those relationships and create some, you know, some harmony. I'd much rather that we bring harmonised, integrated supply chains to the table. So we've been told we're on the clock. 5 minutes, is that right? Okay, a few more questions.
Okay, so
one of this one, or you're one of these guys?
we're talking about short project life cycles in Hong Kong. Typically would be compressed. So it's not uncommon. The procurement will confirm before finishing all the design. For instance, there could be no reinforcement drawings or details available in the contract. Under these circumstances, what can be done to avoid avoidable compensation events from arising during the construction stage?
Who's the contractor here? Sorry, who's the designer here? The contractor or the consultant?
Separate designer and contractor should presume traditional.
So traditional. Okay, so traditional design. Well, what a big risk this is. So I've seen this forever, and all it causes is chaos. So let's sort it out on site. What a good idea that is. So we go to tender on a 2/3 done design, and we sort it out on site. Except on day one, other things occur, and the finishing of the design becomes more difficult and late, and it's just a chaotic way to work. I'm not a fan of it. Don't do it. Well, how about that one?
Okay, right.
To avoid it,
Yeah.
don't do it. If somebody who is the designer has a job to finish their design, in my opinion, before the contractor then bids for that design, don't give a 2/3 design and then finish off the rest. However, if you must, like on an emergency basis, then well, you should be using cost reimbursable contract option E, and then the contractor's protected. I just think it's a false illusion to think that we give a part-done design, the contractor can assume what is obviously going to come, even though they don't know when it will come, and price it. It's a nonsense. It's just absolutely nonsense. It's a bit like, I can't think of the name of it, no, it's gone, where we hand over the designer to the contractor, and they're going to guess the errors. You've got a minute to validate the design and guess the errors. Anyway,
Okay.
don't do it. Don't do that last one.
I know the time is sort of running out, so perhaps I'll just have a last question. But there are a few more sort of questions that we have received from the attendants. So we will sort of, Robert can kindly sort of provide some answers later for the questions, if possible.
No problem. You know my hourly rate. Not a problem.
One second. But then, just one last
it works out to be about $0 an hour.
One last question. Somebody is asking for the NEC contracts. It seems to be sort of gradually pushing ahead with all the infrastructure projects, etc. in Hong Kong. For the traditional building contracts in Hong Kong, what do you think? How can we sort of promote that? And then, is there any sort of changes that would be required for the NEC for particularly building contracts?
Not a single change, I think, after the contracts, but a change in here to the people managing those contracts. Different attitude and mindset. So the architects, so it's quite obvious, isn't it? In the GCC contract, the architect's got their role and the surveyor's got their role, and it doesn't seem particularly integrated to me. Now those same two people can be the project manager in an NEC contract. So the project manager isn't always one person, it can be a group of people. I want people with complementary skills to be, to do some outstandingly competent contract management. So the architect, providing they are extremely good and competent at contract management, is just as capable as being a project manager as a civil engineer is in infrastructure projects. The fact that we don't use the word architect and surveyor, so what? We don't use the word civil engineer, so what? So it's just a role. We call it project manager. I don't care the discipline that does it, providing they are highly competent and highly professional individuals. I think we have to. I think our focus has to be radically changed to engender that collaborative approach that the Development Bureau said desperately wants, and I completely subscribe to that. And we have to have far greater focus on the taxpayer and deliver better returns for the taxpayer. And we have to have far more emphasis on helping our people work not at 8:30 at night on a Monday, do webinars and things like that. Far less stress, far less working hours, far better outcomes. We just have to and focus on great outcomes for the client. So a better product that is cheaper to use, that is cut to cost cheaper, that we beat their expectations in terms of time, cost, quality of the asset. That's where we need to be focusing our effort. We're brilliant people. We just need to have just slightly recalibrate our DNA to focus on better outcomes for everybody.
Indeed. And actually, really, thank you very much, Robert, for this seminar. And literally, we have hundreds of people attending, approaching thousands.
1,000?
So
1,500.
So I'm sure everybody is not sort of complaining about this cold weather. It's a very worthwhile sort of seminar. And for those questions that you haven't been sort of answered, we'll collect it all together, and then we'll send it to Robert, and we'll distribute the answers lately. And everybody, if you still haven't give your details for the CPD certificate, do so ASAP, because otherwise you can't have the certificate issued to you. So thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you very much.
Now, just before go, there is hopefully we want everyone also to help us. There's an evaluation survey, and there is this QR code. If you can kindly scan that, I suppose, and then do the survey, that will help us to further improve on our future seminars and try to get more these guru speakers like Robert on the various topics. So please spend some time, scan the code, and then do the survey. I think this is all for tonight, and I thank everybody. Thank you.